Okay, so the next thing we're going to talk about is choosing a theme based on third-party add-ons. And I like to refer to this as the add-on ecosystem. And, you know, in most cases, what we're talking about are plugins. So if you go to wordpress.org and you search for Genesis in the plugins repository, you're going to find a ton of plugins that are designed specifically to be used by Genesis. There are literally, I mean, I think there's over 100 of them in there, specifically designed to be used for Genesis, and they, you know, do one thing or another. Now, while there are an awful lot of them, they are, as a general rule, very poorly documented and very lightly supported. So while there's an awful lot of them there, their usefulness for a beginner can be limited because there's very little information about how to use them. For Thesis 2.1 there aren't any, right? Because Thesis 2.1 is not GPL compatible. Nothing that works with Thesis 2.1 can be on the WordPress.org repository, and therefore there are no plugins that work with Thesis 2.1 there. Now, to be fair, Thesis 2.1 doesn't need plugins to do the things that all those other plugins that Genesis has do. Right? There are plugins for substituting widget areas, and plugins for changing layouts, and plugins for, you know, doing all kinds of different types of things, and adding menus, rearranging menus, you know, turning on or off titles, or removing sidebars, or, you know, adding author name, or, I mean, there's just all kinds of plugins like that, and by and large, none of that is needed in Thesis. So, you know, the absence of that stuff for Thesis 2.1 is probably shouldn't be considered a negative, because it's just not necessary. Now, as most of you probably know, BYOB website, this website, has a whole bunch of stuff for Thesis and for Genesis. And to be fair, I have way more stuff for Thesis than I do Genesis, right? I've got 4 Genesis plugins. I've not yet published a Genesis child theme, but for Thesis I have, I don't know, 20 some odd boxes, which are the functional equivalent of plugins for Thesis. You know, 2 skins plus 1 free skin. And so BYOB website actually has the largest selection of Thesis add-ons anywhere online. So, and of course, since I wrote them, they're all high quality, and you know. But I think in terms of an ecosystem in and around Thesis 2.1, BYOB website is probably the largest source of a variety of add-on functionality like that. There are also premium plugins out there, although not very many, that are specific to Genesis or specific to Thesis. There are actually only a couple of them specific to Thesis. Most of the ones that are specific to Genesis are just, you know, extended free ones, really. There is one exception to that, and that is the dynamic extender plugin from Cobalt Apps. Now, they have quite the, I guess we never got through to that. Let's see, dynamic extender. Oh, I didn't. I guess. Okay. Dynamic Website Builder versus Genesis Extender. Dynamic Website Builder is a premium child theme that gives you a great deal of control over the layout and style of your site. The Genesis Extender plugin can sit beside. You can install it with any child theme, and it gives you a similar kind of control over what things look like. This is probably the best premium plugin available for Genesis. It's certainly very popular, and in the not very distant future I'll be teaching some classes in how to use it. So, but in terms, the Genesis Extender and Dynamic Website Builder are very significant additions to the Genesis ecosystem. Most of the premium add-ons for Thesis are on my website. Right? Most of them are BYOB website boxes that are available to paid members of my site and aren't available anywhere else. There are a couple of other places that do have a handful of boxes. A notable exception again is Serge Liatko's site. He does have a handful of very significant, compelling ones, including one for converting Thesis post images to WP featured images and stuff like that. So probably between Serge and I, we have the two most significant set of third-party add-ons for Thesis. Now, while we're talking about that, we also should be talking about e-commerce plugins, because e-commerce plugins sort of fill a special role in the WordPress world, in that because they are so complex, they often use their own templating system in order to function properly. And I have a thorough discussion of 5 or 6 of those, the main plugins available out there these days, and including WooCommerce and MarketPress and WP eStore. Some of those e-commerce plugins need help to work both with Thesis and with Genesis. An example of that is WooCommerce. WooCommerce won't work properly out of the box with Genesis. It needs the WooCommerce Genesis Extender plugin available from StudioPress, but nevertheless it requires that plugin in order to make the relationship between the two, unless the skin is very specifically an e-commerce skin that already handles that integration like Clipcart does. You end up needing to use that integration plugin with Genesis. A similar kind of thing happens with, for example, Shop. Shop doesn't work out of the box with Genesis, and in fact there is no plugin that matches the two of them, so you have to add your own custom code to make Shop work. MarketPress anticipates the problem with Genesis and has its own code built in to make sure that it works properly with Genesis. But you know, there are e-commerce plugins that simply don't work properly with Genesis. And it's actually a little bit worse with Thesis, because Thesis doesn't use any physical written templates at all and doesn't integrate them. And so plugins that use their own physical templates like Shop and WooCommerce just don't work out of the box with Thesis. Now, the good news is that there are add-ons that can integrate them. For example, Serge Liatko's Woo Thesis Integrator plugin does a spectacular job of it, and there's absolutely no problem then with using WooCommerce with Thesis. And I have a similar device for MarketPress that integrates Thesis with MarketPress, and so there are helps that, you know, for those kinds of things in both Genesis and Thesis. But nevertheless, if you're using either Thesis or Genesis, you have to be careful about which e-commerce choice you make. And then there is the question of specialty themes, and primarily the specialty theme I'm thinking of is, for example, a real estate site. Real estate sites, Genesis has a great, really, it's not a theme, it's a web application for real estate agents. They call it the Agents Press, but it's more than just a theme. It has all kinds of built-in functionality that make it specialized and useful for real estate agents. Thesis doesn't have anything like that. So if you're a real estate agent and you want some very easy baked-in functionality, you still can't do better than Agents Press. A similar kind of thing can be said for e-commerce themes. There are a handful of e-commerce child themes out there for Genesis. I think the best one alive is Clipcart for Themedy, and they have that for both Thesis and Genesis, so it doesn't really matter which one you are using at that point. Clipcart works with both of them. But otherwise, you're left rolling your own, really using an e-commerce plugin with a non-e-commerce theme often requires you to do a bunch of customization. It's a little bit easier to do that customization in Thesis than it is in Genesis, but nevertheless, they're pretty much equal with each other in terms of availability for e-commerce specific or e-commerce activated themes or child themes and skins.